Few stories in Hollywood are as painful, raw, and misunderstood as that of Chris Rock. To the world, he's the man who made us laugh through the hardest moments, a comedy genius with sharp wit and fearless honesty. But behind the laughter lies a truth that most never see, a truth built on heartbreak, betrayal, and a lifetime of silent pain that shaped every joke he ever told. At 60, Chris Rock's life looks like a success story on paper, decades in film and stand-up, countless awards, and a reputation as one of the greatest comedians alive. Yet beneath the fame is a man who's endured years of emotional struggle, the kind that no amount of laughter can erase. From a painful childhood in Brooklyn to a marriage that ended in devastation, and a shocking betrayal that played out in front of the entire world, Chris's story is far from the fairy tale people imagine. Those who know him say he's been quietly fighting battles most of us could never see. In interviews, he's hinted at sleepless nights, broken trust, and the scars that fame only made deeper. He once said, "The thing about being funny is, sometimes it's the only way to survive." And now, as Chris Rock turns 60, the world is finally beginning to see the man behind the microphone. Not just the jokes, but the pain that gave birth to them. Because the tragedy of Chris Rock isn't just in what happened long before Chris Rock became one of the most respected comedians in the world. He was just a skinny kid growing up in Brooklyn, awkward, shy, and constantly picked on. His childhood wasn't glamorous. It was filled with struggle, fear, and moments that would leave deep emotional scars. "I got bullied every single day," Chris once revealed. It wasn't funny. It was survival. Born in 1965, Chris grew up in a world that was brutally divided by race and class. His parents worked hard. His father, Julius, drove trucks and delivered newspapers. His mother, Rosalie, was a teacher's aide who cleaned houses to make ends meet. They gave him love, but life outside the front door wasn't kind. In school, Chris was one of the only black kids bussed into a predominantly white neighborhood. He endured relentless harassment, beatings, and humiliation. That pain became the seed of his comedy. Instead of breaking him, it taught him how to fight back. Not with fists, but with words. His sharp tongue and quick wit became his armor. "I realized if I could make them laugh," he once said, "maybe they'd stop hitting me." When Chris dropped out of high school, most people assumed he'd disappear into obscurity. But the pain that had shaped him became his greatest weapon. He started performing at tiny New York comedy clubs, telling stories about race, life, and injustice. The laughter he received wasn't just validation, it was healing. By the late 1980s, Chris had caught the eye of Eddie Murphy, who saw something special in the young comedian. Eddie took him under his wing, helping him land roles in Beverly Hills Cop 2 and later on Saturday Night Live. Suddenly, the bullied kid from Brooklyn was standing shoulder to shoulder with comedy's biggest names. But even then, the laughter couldn't erase the loneliness. Behind every joke was a lifetime of pain he'd never fully dealt with. Friends later admitted that Chris often used humor to hide the sadness that never quite left his eyes. "He'd make everyone laugh," one colleague recalled, "then go home alone and think too much." As his fame grew, so did the pressure. Chris's comedy became sharper, bolder. He was no longer just making jokes. He was challenging society, calling out hypocrisy, racism, and human weakness. Specials like Bring the Pain and Bigger and Blacker turned him into a legend. But to those who listened closely, there was always a layer of heartbreak beneath the laughter. He wasn't just entertaining, he was coping. Chris once said, "You can't fake funny. You either live it or you don't." And he had lived it. Every wound, every rejection, every heartbreak. His ability to turn trauma into truth made him untouchable on stage, but privately, it also made him isolated. The deeper he went into his own pain to make others laugh, the less people really saw the man behind the act. By the time he reached his 40s, Chris Rock was a global superstar, but inside, he was still that kid trying to make sense of a world that never played fair. And though success gave him everything he thought he wanted, it couldn't heal what had been broken long ago. What happened next would test him like never before. A heartbreak that would change the way he saw love, trust, and himself forever. Ned to him. It's in how long he had to carry it alone. By the time Chris Rock reached the peak of his fame, it looked like he had it all: money, success, family, and respect. But behind that picture-perfect image was a marriage quietly crumbling under the weight of pressure, temptation, and unspoken pain. In 1996, Chris married Malak Compton, a woman who seemed to ground him when his world was spinning too fast. They built a life together, raised two beautiful daughters, and for nearly 2 decades looked like the model Hollywood couple. Fans admired them, the brilliant comedian and the humanitarian wife, proof that love could survive fame. But fame, as Chris would later admit, can be the cruelest test of all. In his stand-up specials, Chris often joked about marriage, calling it both heaven and hell. At the time, people laughed, thinking it was just part of his act. But those jokes were more truth than comedy. Behind closed doors, the relationship had grown distant. Chris was touring constantly, working on movies, living the exhausting double life of a man who wanted to be a star and a husband at the same time. In 2014, after 18 years of marriage, everything fell apart. Chris and Malak announced their divorce, and what followed exposed the cracks he'd kept hidden for years. He later admitted in interviews that he had been unfaithful, struggling with temptation and poor choices that destroyed the trust between them. "I was a piece of crap," he said bluntly. "You don't want to be that guy." But I was. The divorce hit him harder than anyone realized. He lost more than a marriage. He lost a sense of who he was. Friends said he spiraled into deep depression, isolating himself from everyone. "It was one of the darkest times of my life," he confessed. "I had to look at myself in a way I never had before, but even in that darkness, Chris did something he'd always done. He turned his pain into truth." In 2018, he released his Netflix special Tambourine, where he spoke openly about his mistakes, his therapy, and his journey toward healing. It wasn't just a comedy show. It was a confession, a raw, unfiltered look into a man learning to forgive himself. He revealed that therapy had helped him confront not just the mistakes of his marriage, but also the unresolved trauma from his childhood. "You can't run from yourself forever," he said. "Eventually, you have to sit with your pain and listen." The honesty stunned fans. For the first time, they saw Chris Rock not as the confident, untouchable comedian, but as a human being, fragile and flawed. Critics called Tambourine his most powerful work, not because it was funny, but because it was real. Even after the show's success, the heartbreak lingered. Chris once said that divorce doesn't just end a marriage, it ends the version of yourself you thought you were. He had to rebuild his identity, piece by piece, without the family unit he once believed would last forever. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of it all was this. While the world kept laughing, Chris was quietly learning how to live again. Every smile, every joke was part of the healing process. He had lost love, but in the wreckage, he found something else. A chance to start over, to tell his story honestly, and to finally stop hiding behind the laughter. Yet just as he began to find peace, fate would hand him another moment that would shake his entire world, not in private this time, but on live television, with millions watching. March 27, 2022, a night that was supposed to celebrate the best in Hollywood, quickly turned into one of the most shocking moments in live television history. The Oscars. Glitz, glamour, laughter, and then silence. Chris Rock walked on stage, smiling as always, ready to do what he'd done for decades, make the world laugh. But within seconds, that smile would disappear, and the world would see a side of him no one had ever seen before. Chris made a joke, a light one, or so he thought, about Jada Pinkett Smith's shaved head, referencing G.I. Jane. It was a typical Chris Rock moment, edgy, unscripted, and quick. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Will Smith, one of Hollywood's most respected actors and Chris's longtime acquaintance, suddenly walked up to the stage. The audience thought it was part of the act. But then, with a sound that echoed across the globe, Will struck Chris across the face. For a few long seconds, time stood still. The room went dead silent. Millions watched in disbelief as Chris, stunned but composed, tried to process what had just happened. "Will Smith just smacked the wows out of me," he said, half laughing, half shocked. And even then, in the middle of one of the most humiliating moments of his life, he chose not to fight back. The internet exploded. Social media was on fire within seconds. Memes, arguments, and headlines flooded every corner of the world. But behind the noise was a man who had just been publicly assaulted and embarrassed in front of his peers, and millions of viewers. It wasn't just about a slap. It was about dignity, pain, and control. Chris didn't retaliate. He didn't curse. He didn't walk off the stage. He stood there, composed, professional, and heartbroken. That moment revealed something extraordinary about him. For a man who had been bullied, beaten, and belittled as a kid, he had learned that sometimes silence is the loudest response. In the days that followed, everyone had an opinion. Some supported Will, others stood by Chris. Hollywood divided itself in two, but Chris stayed silent. For months, he said nothing publicly. Not one interview, not one statement. Behind the scenes, though, the emotional toll was heavy. Friends described him as withdrawn, deeply hurt, and struggling to make sense of it all. He was humiliated in front of the entire world, one insider said. You don't just shake that off. It wasn't until nearly a year later, during his Netflix Live special Selective Outrage, that Chris finally addressed the incident. But instead of a bitter rant, he turned it into a masterclass in self-control, honesty, and raw emotion. He told the audience, "People ask me if it hurt. It still hurts. But I'm not a victim. I took that hit like Pacquiao." The crowd roared, but beneath the laughter, everyone could feel his pain. He spoke not just about the slap, but about what it represented. The unfairness, the double standards, and the quiet suffering of someone who had spent his whole life turning pain into jokes. "You never know what people are going through," he said. "I try to make people laugh, but I'm human too." That night reminded the world that even the strongest among us can be broken in an instant. But what truly defined Chris Rock wasn't the slap. It was his response. He didn't lash out. He didn't fall apart. He did what he's always done, turned heartbreak into strength and pain into power. Still, as the world moved on, Chris continued to carry the weight of that night. Fame, as he would later say, doesn't protect you from pain. It just puts it on display. In the months after the Oscars, Chris Rock's life changed forever, not just in the eyes of the public, but within himself. The world saw a man slapped on live television. What they didn't see was the quiet, painful journey that followed, a journey of healing, reflection, and rediscovery. Chris withdrew from the spotlight for a while. He kept his circle small, focused on his daughters, and leaned on the therapy he'd already been doing for years. "I had to remind myself who I was," he later shared. "One moment doesn't define you. How you move forward does." Those words became his mantra, a promise to himself that he wouldn't let that night break him. He began performing again, slowly at first, testing new material in small clubs, reconnecting with his audience. But this time, there was something different about him. The sharp wit was still there, but the edge was calmer, wiser. The jokes weren't just about getting laughs. They were about reclaiming his voice. He turned trauma into truth, pain into performance. Every show was a step toward taking back his dignity. Fans noticed it too. When he finally spoke about the infamous Oscars moment in his Netflix special Selective Outrage, people didn't just see a comedian. They saw a survivor. Someone who refused to be defined by humiliation, but instead used it as fuel to grow stronger. "I'm not a victim," he declared. "I took that hit like a champ." The audience erupted in applause. In that instant, Chris Rock didn't just make people laugh, he made them feel. Behind the scenes, he was rebuilding. He began traveling again, reconnecting with old friends, even exploring love with a new sense of caution and maturity. Those close to him said he seemed more at peace, more self-aware. "He's calmer now," one friend said. "It's like he's finally learned how to carry the pain without letting it carry him." The tragedy of Chris Rock isn't just the heartbreak, the betrayal, or the humiliation. It's the reality that even those who make the world laugh often suffer the most in silence. But the triumph of Chris Rock is that he refuses to stay broken. Every time life knocked him down, from his childhood struggles to his divorce to the slaps seen around the world, he got back up. Stronger, smarter, sharper. In interviews, Chris often reflects on gratitude. He's thankful for his daughters, for his audience, and for the lessons that came from hardship. "I'm still here," he once said with a smile. Still standing. Still laughing. That's all that matters. He knows that pain doesn't disappear. It just transforms. And in that transformation lies power. He's turned the worst moments of his life into lessons about strength, forgiveness, and authenticity. His story reminds us that laughter isn't the opposite of pain. It's often born from it. As Chris Rock steps into his 60s, he's not chasing fame anymore. He's chasing peace. He's not trying to prove he's funny. The world already knows that. What he wants now is freedom. Freedom from regret, from bitterness, from the need to be perfect. And that may be the greatest victory of all. The tragedy of Chris Rock's life may be beyond heartbreaking, but it's also deeply human. Because through every wound, every mistake, and every tear, he's shown us something beautiful. That even in the darkest moments, there's always light. And sometimes the greatest punchline is survival itself.